The shop opens at 7 in the morning. The lights come on. The shutters rise. The first delivery arrives. A familiar customer walks through the door. Everything looks normal. But for the owner, something has changed. There is a new calculation behind every ordinary decision. Which people are standing outside? Who has been asking questions? Who was seen near the store yesterday? Is that unfamiliar car parked across the street by coincidence, or is someone watching? Nothing has to happen. That is the frightening part. A protection racket works best when the victim already understands the reputation behind the demand. The criminal does not necessarily need to demonstrate violence every time money is requested. The threat can exist in the victim's imagination because the organization has spent years building a reputation that makes the consequences feel real. The demand itself can therefore be deceptively simple. Pay. And the implication is even simpler. Something bad might happen if the payment stops. That was the psychological architecture of the protection racket. It turned fear into a recurring expense. For a small business owner, the stakes were unusually high. A neighborhood restaurant, grocery store, construction company, barbershop or market stall could represent years of work and a family's entire financial future. The business was not an abstract investment sitting inside a portfolio. It was personal. The owner might know every employee by name. The family might live above the premises. The business might have been built by a parent and inherited by a son or daughter. Closing it could mean losing not merely income, but identity, stability, and a future that had taken decades to construct. Criminal organizations understood that vulnerability. And the most disturbing feature of the racket was the reversal at its center. The criminal group could present itself as the answer to a problem that the business owner had never asked for. Protection from whom? Protection from what? Sometimes the implied danger was simply the reputation of the organization itself. The message was not necessarily, a specific attack will occur at a specific time. It could be far more ambiguous. The owner was made to understand that refusing cooperation could create trouble. That ambiguity was powerful. A clearly stated threat can be reported and investigated. A vague threat can live inside someone's mind. The business owner begins filling in the blanks. What could happen? Who could be involved? Would the employees be safe? Would the store be damaged? Would customers stop coming? Would the family become involved? The uncertainty itself becomes part of the coercion. And once fear enters everyday decision-making, ordinary life changes. A restaurant owner might look at a busy evening and think about whether the business is attracting too much attention. A shopkeeper might notice an unfamiliar person and wonder whether the person has been sent to watch the premises. A construction contractor might hesitate before accepting a new project because of concerns about who else wants the work. The criminal organization does not need to be physically present everywhere. Its reputation can travel ahead of it. That is why reputation was one of the most valuable assets in organized crime. Money can be counted. Buildings can be purchased. Vehicles can be seized. But reputation is different. It exists in people's expectations. If enough people believe an organization is capable of retaliation, that belief can influence behavior even when no direct action occurs. This created a disturbing form of power. The criminal group could control decisions without constantly using force. Fear did the work. The victim could become an unwilling participant in maintaining the organization's reputation. If one business owner paid quietly, another might assume payment was necessary. If another owner remained silent, the silence could reinforce the impression that everyone was complying. Soon the entire neighborhood could become trapped inside an invisible system. Nobody needed to announce that the system existed. Everyone simply understood it. And that collective silence was extraordinarily valuable to the people running the racket. The individual victim might think, "There is nothing I can do." But the owner might not know what neighboring businesses were experiencing. Perhaps the bakery was paying. Perhaps the restaurant was paying. Perhaps the construction company had already received demands. Perhaps everyone was privately frightened. But because nobody talked openly, each victim could believe that resistance was impossible. This is one of the most important psychological features of organized extortion. Isolation makes fear stronger. A person facing a threat alone may believe the organization is vastly more powerful than it actually is. The victim sees the criminal network. The victim does not see the other victims. That imbalance matters. The racketeer appears to have information. The business owner appears to have none. The organization knows its own reputation. The owner only knows what has been heard through rumors, stories, and personal experience. And rumors can become powerful. One business is damaged. Someone disappears from the neighborhood. A store suddenly closes. A contractor refuses a job. Nobody knows exactly why. But the story spreads. That is what happens when people refuse. Whether every detail is true becomes almost irrelevant. The story itself becomes a warning. This is how an atmosphere of intimidation can become self-sustaining. And yet there was another reason small businesses were particularly vulnerable. They could not simply disappear. A multinational corporation can move capital. A large company can hire lawyers, security specialists, and investigators. A small business owner may have a mortgage, employees, suppliers, and a family depending on tomorrow's revenue. The owner's choices are therefore constrained. Walking away is not simple. Relocating is expensive. Closing the business may destroy years of work. Publicly confronting an organized criminal group may appear terrifying. Even reporting the demand can feel risky if the victim believes retaliation is possible. That is why protection rackets should never be understood merely as transactions. They were systems of coercion. The payment was only the visible part. Behind it stood fear, reputation, silence, and economic dependency. And the most sinister feature was that the criminal organization could make the payment appear almost normal. A business owner might eventually think of it as another operating expense. Rent, electricity, insurance, payroll, and the payment demanded by criminals. That psychological normalization was a victory for the racketeer. Because once extortion becomes routine, the extraordinary begins to feel ordinary. The victim is no longer asking, "Why is this happening?" The victim is asking, "How do I get through this month?" That is the moment when fear becomes a business model. And somewhere in the neighborhood, behind ordinary storefronts and familiar streets, the people collecting the money could begin to believe that the system would continue forever. The most revealing part of a protection racket may not be the moment when money changes hands. It is what happens afterward. The shopkeeper returns to work. The restaurant opens for dinner. Employees arrive for another shift. Customers continue buying groceries, ordering meals, or getting their hair cut. From the outside, nothing has changed. Inside the business owner's mind, everything has changed. The first payment can create a strange psychological boundary. Before it, the demand feels impossible and outrageous. After it, the owner may begin thinking about something much more practical: how to keep the business running without making the situation worse. That does not mean the victim accepts the criminal organization's authority. It means the victim is adapting to coercion. And adaptation can be extraordinarily powerful. A person under persistent pressure does not always make decisions according to what would be ideal in a world without threats. The person makes decisions according to what appears survivable. That distinction explains why protection rackets could persist for years. The business owner may calculate the immediate consequences of resistance against the immediate consequences of compliance. If refusing might endanger the business, the family, or employees, paying can appear to be the safer choice, even when the owner knows perfectly well that the demand is unjust. The criminal organization has therefore changed the victim's decision-making environment. The question is no longer, should this person be allowed to demand money? The question becomes, what happens if the owner says no? That is a very different psychological problem. And uncertainty makes it worse. A direct and predictable threat is frightening, but uncertainty can be even more consuming. The victim may not know exactly what the organization is capable of, what it knows about the business, or whether refusing one demand will lead to something more serious. The imagination fills the gaps. A person begins replaying conversations. A strange telephone call suddenly seems significant. A vehicle parked outside becomes suspicious. An unfamiliar customer attracts attention. A casual remark from an employee can trigger concern. The business owner may begin seeing potential threats everywhere. This is how fear can move from a specific incident into everyday life. The racket no longer exists only when the criminals appear. It exists between appearances. That psychological pressure could also affect family relationships. A business owner might hesitate to tell relatives what is happening. Perhaps the owner fears causing panic. Perhaps the family depends on the business. Perhaps the owner believes silence will protect everyone. But secrecy creates isolation. The person carrying the burden becomes increasingly alone with it. And that isolation benefits the extortionist. The less people communicate, the harder it becomes for victims to discover that others may be experiencing the same thing. This is one of the hidden mechanisms behind organized intimidation. Fear becomes stronger when people believe they are isolated. Imagine several business owners along the same street. Each privately receives demands. Each assumes the others may know more. Each notices that nobody talks about it. Each therefore concludes that speaking first could be dangerous. The result is collective silence. Ironically, everyone may be frightened by the same organization while believing that everyone else is cooperating willingly. That misunderstanding can keep the racket alive. The criminal organization appears stronger than it actually is because the victims cannot see the full scale of their shared experience. This is why cooperation between victims can become so important when a racket is finally challenged. Once people begin talking, the psychological landscape can change. The shopkeeper discovers that the restaurant owner was also pressured. The restaurant owner discovers that another business received a similar demand. The contractor learns that other contractors faced comparable pressure. Suddenly, isolated fear becomes a recognizable pattern. That can be a turning point. But reaching it is difficult. There is another complication: economic dependency. Small businesses often operate with narrow margins. A large corporation may absorb a temporary loss or relocate operations. A family business may not have that luxury. The owner may have employees whose salaries depend on the next week's revenue. Suppliers may need to be paid. Loans may be outstanding. Rent may be due. Children may depend on the family's income. Every threat therefore carries a financial dimension. The criminal organization is not merely threatening a building. It is threatening the stability surrounding the building. That can make the psychological pressure much greater. And it explains why some victims may appear to cooperate for long periods before eventually seeking help. From the outside, observers may ask an uncomfortable question: why didn't they simply refuse? The answer is that refusal is not an abstract moral decision when someone believes that other people may suffer as a consequence. The victim is calculating risk. The calculation may be wrong. It may be based partly on rumors. It may be based on the organization's reputation. It may be based on previous incidents. But the fear feels real. And that is enough to influence behavior. There is also a phenomenon that can make prolonged coercion particularly damaging: normalization. The first demand is shocking. The fifth may be terrifying. But after repeated exposure, the victim may begin treating the situation as part of ordinary business life. That does not make the victim comfortable. It means the mind has adapted. Humans are remarkably capable of adapting to circumstances that would initially seem intolerable. That ability can help people survive. But in a protection racket, it can also allow the criminal system to become embedded. The payment becomes routine. The silence becomes routine. The anxiety becomes routine. The owner begins organizing life around the demands. And the criminal organization benefits from predictability. This is why the racket can resemble a tax system, except the tax authority has no legitimate authority and the payment is extracted through coercion. The victim may even begin planning financially around the demand. That is one of the most disturbing transformations. A crime has been converted into an operating condition. But there is another psychological weapon: uncertainty about who is actually in control. The victim may never know exactly how large the organization is. They may hear stories about connections to other businesses, neighborhoods, or criminal groups. They may not know which threats are genuine and which are exaggerated. That uncertainty can make the organization appear larger than it really is. Reputation becomes a form of psychological amplification. One frightening story can become 10. 10 can become a neighborhood legend. And a neighborhood legend can influence behavior for years. This is why organized crime has historically relied not only on direct coercion but also on reputation, social influence, and silence. The objective is to make resistance feel futile. Yet every system based on fear contains a weakness. It depends on people believing that resistance will fail. If enough victims discover that they are not alone, that belief can begin to break. A shopkeeper who once thought, "If I speak, I will stand alone," may eventually realize, everyone has been experiencing the same thing. That changes the calculation. Fear is still present. But now there is solidarity. And solidarity creates information. Information creates evidence. Evidence creates the possibility of investigation. The protection racket therefore contains a paradox. Its greatest strength is psychological. Its greatest weakness is psychological too. The criminals need victims to believe they are powerless. The moment victims begin to understand the system collectively, the image of unlimited power can start to fracture. And once that image fractures, the money trail becomes much easier to follow. Because every payment that once looked like an isolated act of fear can become something else. A pattern. And patterns are exactly what investigators need. For years, the payments can disappear into the background. A business owner hands over money. Another owner does the same. A third keeps quiet. Nothing appears to change. Then one person decides that silence has become more dangerous than speaking. That moment can transform an entire investigation. The first breakthrough in a protection racket is not always a dramatic arrest. Sometimes it is a conversation. A business owner finally tells investigators what has been happening. Another victim confirms the story. A third provides records, dates, or names. Suddenly, what looked like an isolated incident begins to resemble a system. That is when the criminal organization's greatest weapon, silence, can become its greatest weakness. Investigators can begin comparing accounts. Who received demands? When did they begin? How often did payments occur? Were similar people involved? Did the same names appear? Were businesses in the same area targeted? Did money eventually move toward the same individuals or organizations? The answers can reveal a structure that individual victims could never see. A single payment is difficult to interpret. Hundreds of similar payments are something else entirely. This is why cooperation can be so important in organized crime investigations. Victims who once believed they were alone can provide pieces of a much larger picture. One business owner may remember a conversation. Another may have retained a receipt or financial record. Someone else may remember a vehicle, location, or intermediary. A fourth person may know that another business was approached. None of these details has to solve the case by itself. Together, they can establish a pattern. And patterns are powerful evidence. The investigator's task is to transform fear into something that can survive outside the victim's memory. Dates can be documented. Payments can be traced. Communications can be examined. Business relationships can be reconstructed. Financial records can reveal connections. The invisible system becomes increasingly visible. Money is particularly revealing because extortion depends on repeated financial transfers. The organization needs revenue. That means the criminal activity generates a financial footprint. Investigators can examine whether payments from apparently unrelated businesses ultimately connect to the same individuals or entities. They can compare business records with known associates. They can examine corporate structures. They can reconstruct transactions. And sometimes the financial trail reveals something that intimidation alone cannot. Hierarchy. A victim may know the person who delivered a demand. The victim may not know who ultimately benefited. Financial investigation can potentially bridge that gap. The person collecting money may be only one link in a larger organization. This is one reason organized crime investigations can take so long. The visible actor is not necessarily the person directing the operation. The person making a demand may know only part of the structure. Investigators therefore have to work upward and sideways through the evidence. Who gave the instruction? Who received the money? Who controlled the relevant business relationship? Who communicated with whom? Who benefited? The answers can reveal an organization that looks very different from the collection of individual incidents reported by victims. But the psychological dimension remains crucial. A protection racket depends heavily on the belief that criminals cannot be challenged. If victims believe the organization is untouchable, they remain silent. If they remain silent, investigators receive less information. If investigators receive less information, the organization appears even more untouchable. It becomes a cycle. Fear creates silence. Silence creates invisibility. Invisibility creates the appearance of power. And the appearance of power creates more fear. Breaking that cycle is therefore enormously important. Public prosecutions can have an effect far beyond the defendants in a particular case. When business owners see people who once appeared untouchable being investigated and prosecuted, the psychological balance can shift. The message changes. The criminal organization is no longer an invisible force. It is a group of identifiable people facing identifiable consequences. That can encourage additional victims to come forward. And every new witness can strengthen the investigation. This is why law enforcement sometimes describes organized crime cases as building from the ground up. The process can begin with a seemingly minor complaint. Then another. Then another. Eventually, investigators realize that the incidents are connected. A neighborhood story becomes a criminal pattern. A criminal pattern becomes a network. And the network becomes a case. The consequences can also reach legitimate businesses that have been forced to operate under the racket. Once the system is disrupted, owners may regain something they had gradually lost: freedom of choice. They can decide which suppliers to use, which contracts to accept, Where to invest. Whether to expand. Whether to hire. The absence of intimidation changes the business environment itself. That is an important point because the damage caused by protection rackets is not limited to the money extracted. The racket interferes with economic decision-making. A business owner may avoid expanding because expansion could attract attention. A contractor may avoid certain projects. A restaurant may change operating practices because of fear. A company may refuse legitimate opportunities. The criminal organization therefore distorts the local economy even when no direct threat is being made at that exact moment. The neighborhood begins operating according to invisible rules. And those rules are created by fear rather than law. Breaking the racket restores something larger than individual financial security. It restores the idea that legitimate economic decisions should be made freely. That is why successful investigations can have a powerful symbolic effect. They demonstrate that intimidation is not permanent. The reputation of an organization can be dismantled. Its members can be identified. Its financial structure can be investigated. Its victims can become witnesses. And its supposedly invisible network can become evidence. There is a final irony in the psychology of protection rackets. The criminals often depend on the belief that nobody will ever talk. But organized crime creates many potential witnesses. Every payment involves someone. Every demand involves someone. Every business relationship involves someone. Every financial transfer leaves some kind of trace. The larger the racket becomes, the more people potentially know something about it. The system therefore contains the seeds of its own exposure. The very scale that generates more money generates more witnesses. The very repetition that makes the racket profitable creates patterns. The very reputation that keeps victims silent can eventually become evidence when multiple people describe the same behavior. And once that happens, the psychological weapon begins turning against its creators. The business owner who once looked through the window and wondered whether someone was watching can eventually sit across from an investigator and tell the story. The restaurant owner who once kept silent can discover that other owners were afraid too. The contractor who believed refusal was impossible can learn that the organization was not as invulnerable as it appeared. The fear does not disappear overnight. But it loses its monopoly. That is the real turning point. A protection racket is ultimately an attempt to control behavior through fear. It tells the victim, "You have no choice." But the entire system depends on that statement being believed. Once victims begin cooperating, once investigators connect the payments, once financial records reveal the relationships, and once prosecutors establish the facts in court, the illusion of unlimited power can collapse. The money trail becomes evidence. The silence becomes testimony. The reputation becomes a liability. And the neighborhood that once seemed controlled by an invisible criminal authority can begin returning to something far more ordinary. A place where a business owner can open the doors in the morning and worry about customers, employees, suppliers, and the future. Not about whether refusing an illegal demand will cost everything. That is ultimately what separates a protection racket from legitimate business. One operates through choice. The other operates by taking choice away. And once that difference becomes visible, the word protection begins to reveal the truth behind the entire scheme. It was never protection. It was coercion disguised as a service, and a business model built on convincing ordinary people that they were powerless to say no.